We have three very distinguished speakers who can stimulate your brain even after your stomach has been overstimulated. So the first session, as you're aware, we focus on infrastructure. This is the second session where we focus on finance and economics. So we are very honored this morning to have our first speaker, Dr. Ariel Cohen. Dr. Cohen is presently the Senior Fellow of International Tax and Investment Center, and he is also a Director of Energy Growth and Security Program and a non-resident Senior Fellow at Atlantic Council.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming here after such a tasty lunch and a wonderful presentation. I'll try to keep you awake. So, the future is calling is the focus of my presentation on Central Asia and the development of the infrastructure there. The Belt and Road Initiative was declared by Chairman Xi Jinping in Astana in 2013, and this, as we heard earlier this morning, a strategic multinational effort by China and the countries that are partners of China to develop their infrastructure. But as the previous speakers, and especially the excellent presentations by the ministers indicated, it's not just about infrastructure. It's also about geoeconomics, meaning the creation of the economic zone that China will be dominant in, and geopolitics, that the model of the game that we call Go in the West, which is very different than any other games that other great powers play. I always said that when the Chinese play Go, the Russians play chess or checkers, and the Americans play American football, and you see the difference. So in Central Asia, the situation after the collapse of the Soviet Union was that all the infrastructure was aimed at connecting Moscow to essentially the provinces that first the Russian Empire ruled. The Russian Empire conquered most of Central Asia in the end of the 18th century and the 19th century, and literally all the roads, all the railroads led to Moscow, and there was no modern infrastructure to speak of. There was no fiber optic cables. The networks of oil and gas pipelines were very limited, and all that needed to be built. And luckily for me, I started as the head of Russian and Eurasian studies at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, a big think tank in '92, right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and sort of accompanied this development of Western investment in the '90s and the early 2000s, and then the Chinese investment. And interestingly enough, Russia, that used to be the colonial power in Central Asia, is no longer as significant economic actor as China is, or as the West was in the 1990s. So if you look at the indicators, the GDP, an important indicator, Kazakhstan, of course, is the leader. Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan are the two next. Uzbekistan, which has twice the population of Kazakhstan, over 25 million people, and Turkmenistan with a lot of gas, the fourth largest reserves of gas. These are the leaders, and also Kazakhstan is the leader in GDP per capita, with Turkmenistan second. And Uzbekistan is now only playing the catch-up game with President Mirziyoyev, the second president after independence, opening the country and playing the catch-up. They have a long, long way to go, but Uzbekistan in one way or another, was there in Central Asia for at least 1,500 years. And I think that the future for them is bright if they do the right thing. For example, if they learn from Singapore. The roads, the corridors you see include both north-south, very important for China, to Gwadar in Pakistan, and also surrounding India, giving it a hug, which India may not enjoy that much. So having Pakistan as a counterbalance to India, very important for China, with Gwadar, with the roads and the port, and then eventually possibly the pipeline. The northern route through Kazakhstan to Russia, the southern route through Iran and Turkey to Europe, another two corridors, energy corridors from Russia to China, both oil and gas, and then the southern corridors I'm not going to cover very much. You also have railroads, Baku, Tbilisi cars from the Caspian to Turkey and to Europe was already mentioned. The port of Baku, the port of Poti in Georgia, this is all very important for north-south. Actually, these ports were already used for geopolitical, not geoeconomic reasons in what? In the war in Afghanistan, when the United States supplied US troops in Afghanistan, bringing containers to the Black Sea, to Poti, and then going from west to east to the Caspian, crossing the Caspian, Turkmenistan or Kazakhstan, and then eventually going into Afghanistan. And the dry port, very interesting dry port of Khorgos in Kazakhstan, the China-Kazakhstan border, they have a capacity for literally tens of thousands of containers there. There's an open air bazaar. It's still kind of underdeveloped, but they're working on that very hard. Airports, the Kazakhs are developing a big airport in Almaty and in Astana. If you fly from the North Pole into South Asia or Southeast Asia, actually it makes sense to stop in Kazakhstan and refuel there and continue. And very important beyond that, new financial centers like Astana International Financial Center that I do some advisory work with. They took the International Financial Center model. We had the chief judge earlier from Dubai. There's another one in Morocco. So these new international financial centers are the attempt to quickly leapfrog from the resource-based economy, oil, gas in Kazakhstan, metals in Kazakhstan, cotton in Uzbekistan, and jump into financial services and into the 21st century with having a stock market, having an international court with English law, British judges, and providing services with a much, much higher added value. Energy is a terrific area for all of Central Asia. If you look at this graphic, Kazakhstan has 70% of energy coming from coal, whereas Turkmenistan, with its massive gas resources, has 100% coming from gas. Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, the vast majority of energy comes from hydro. And the big challenge today, my company, International Market Analysis, is doing energy consulting work as well as strategic communications. A lot of the challenges in energy today in Central Asia is how they're preparing for renewables. Because they have sun, they have wind. Kazakhstan has a lot of wind, and southern republics like Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan have a lot of sun, but the infrastructure is not there. They don't even have trained engineers, trained civil servants. The legislation is not written. The grid is not smart. The storage is not there. So there's tons of work that they're starting doing, creating first solar parks that both the Chinese and the Europeans are helping to finance, and we'll talk about financing in a moment. Something I worked for more than 10 years ago, TAPI, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India gas pipeline. Very interesting. So what would be a problem? Turkmenistan has a lot of gas. Pakistan has shortage of energy. India has shortage of energy. How you get gas from Turkmenistan to Pakistan and India? What's the problem? The problem is the warfare in Afghanistan. If that is resolved somehow, miraculously from God, or by people finally getting some reason and figuring out that they can make a lot of money just from transit fees and have gas to generate electricity for their homes, for their computers, for their kids, for air conditioning, this gas pipeline will be really profitable for the tribes and for the people who live in these areas. They can even be hired to protect the pipeline, as often people do in problematic areas. Instead of blowing it up and shooting at it, they'll be the guards. Okay? So, interestingly enough, it's the Middle Eastern countries that want to invest in that pipeline. Saudi Arabia, Emirates, etc. And we'll talk about it in a moment. The Chinese, of course, are the leaders in energy investment throughout Central Asia. They're the largest and probably the only customer Turkmenistan has for its gas. They are investing in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, both in energy and non-energy areas. Renewables that we already mentioned is part of Kazakhstan 2050 strategy. Wind and solar farms, $200 million business, more or less. Just recently opened a solar Saran plant, 100 megawatt. A lot of space in Kazakhstan, a lot of wind in Kazakhstan, a lot of sun in Uzbekistan, so there's a lot of potential there. Big challenge is information and communication. You have Chinese investment, Western initiatives, and local initiatives, and the problem is how capital intensive that is. I'll show you in a moment. This is foreign direct investment in general, net inflows. Kazakhstan is the leader with 17 billion in 2017. Turkmenistan is second, 4 billion, and then altogether it's 23 billion. It's not that much. But I wanted to find this table. Okay, this table somehow we missed. I had a table in the report. We did a big report on infrastructure investment in Central Asia, and one of the tables we have is percentages of population with Wi-Fi access or cable access. And only 1/3 in Kazakhstan, and teen numbers, low two-figure numbers in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, and even single numbers in a country like Tajikistan. So big upside in investment if you figure out the business case for broadband internet in Central Asia. We're talking 70 million people, so a little bit more than in Singapore. Okay, renewables we talked about, information communication we talked about, still shortage of that infrastructure. So now let's talk about money. The challenge in this part of the world, in utilities, for example, or in infrastructure projects, is what Minister of Trade talked about. You have to examine every case and figure out how is that going to be profitable. Unless you are an international assistance program, that profitability is not the top of your priority. And you have one of the models that people like to talk about is a public-private partnership. In millions of dollars right now since 1990, 885 million in Kazakhstan, almost $1 billion in Tajikistan, and a little bit less in, considerably less in Uzbekistan. An example would be a big hydropower dam. So both Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan are mountainous countries. have a lot of water in the mountains, have a tradition from the Soviet era of building hydroelectric power stations, potentially can export electricity to Afghanistan and even to Pakistan, but you need to build it, you need to build the dams, the power stations, the infrastructure, and operate them. So that is the challenge, and private-public would be one of the ways to defer the risks to the private sector. The government provides the regulatory framework, some money, and then brings a partner to do that. Kazakhstan is more advanced. They do also roads in the public-private, and these are toll roads. If you do it right, you make money. If you do it wrong, you lose. We cannot talk about Belt and Road without focusing on the strategic and geopolitical aspects. Until recently, I made a case of Belt and Road as an example where US and China can work together. Unfortunately, I cannot make this case any longer because people in the US woke up one day, it was pretty sudden, I must say, and decided that we are in a trade war with China. Of course, it didn't start with Mr. Trump. It started with a pivot to Asia under Mr. Obama. But under Obama, it was more rhetoric and not a lot of investment. Under Trump, it is much more confrontational. The trade war, of course, you hear about, but also a part of that is the rhetoric from the highest levels, from Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, attacking the idea of Belt and Road. And my answer to that is attacking is not enough. We need to come up with two things. One, we need to have an American alternative. And two, for a number of reasons, also diplomatic reasons, we need to say that we are prepared to work with China in a framework that is negotiable and be a part of Belt and Road on the economic terms, provided companies can go in and make money. On the other hand, when I went to Beijing and talked to the Chinese officials about it, they were not very excited to entertain the idea that Americans will come and be partners. I said, so in the end of the day, the International Infrastructure Development Bank, is it a Chinese proposition or there's true multilateral management? And they said to me, off the record, of course it's a Chinese proposition, it's Chinese board, it's Chinese senior officials, etc. But it's not only the United States, it's also Japan, India, Australia, and Europeans who are worried about the rise of the Chinese economic power. And from history, we know with the British Empire, with the US and others, that the gun follows the trader. If you want academic literature, Gallagher and Robinson, that I used in my PhD work on comparative imperial history, Gallagher and Robinson make a case for the British trade imperialism in the 18th and 19th century, followed by the British power. Why would that be different with China? You have to convince me. So the US started looking at the Belt and Road from the strategic and military perspective. I think they're overemphasizing the military part. But on the other hand, when you're looking where the Chinese are locating their bases in Djibouti next to the Americans, next to the French, yes, there is a strategic component to it. I think we are maybe 20 years before the massive military power being deployed along the maritime part of the Belt and Road, but I'm pretty sure it's coming. 70% of ASEAN population said the government should be cautious in negotiating BRI projects to avoid getting into unsustainable financial debts with China. A view strongest in Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand. One-third of people are now, one-third of people have little or no confidence in the US as a strategic partner and provider of regional security. So in Central Asia, I just had a correspondence with one of the senior officials in the region, and he said, yeah, countries further away from Belt and Road may be more suspicious. We think we can manage the Chinese investment. They have experience doing that, and they really, really need the infrastructure. Even in the countries where there is a suspicion of the Chinese historically, such as Kazakhstan, when they wanted to open the leasing of land in Kazakhstan, there were riots. And it was just not purchase, it was leasing for 25 years. There were riots. But still, they want to do business with China. It's getting harder. You have US Secretary of State Pompeo saying, quote, we want all nations, every nation, to be able to protect their sovereignty from coercion by other countries. While where America goes, we seek partnership, not domination. We believe in strategic partnership, not strategic dependency. And Mr. Xi says, Mr. Xi, China wants a principle of wide consultation, joint contribution, shared benefits. But in the end of the day, Belt and Road is made in China. US and China clash on BRI. Former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson criticized BRI and said this is a trading short-term games for long-term dependency. John Bolton says OBOR is a Belt and Road part to develop series of trade routes leading to and from China with the ultimate goal of advancing Chinese global dominance. And there are Chinese generals who talk about power projection along the Silk Road. The national security doctrine says China is using economic inducements and penalties, influence operations, implied military threats to persuade other states to heed its political and security agenda. The debt threat, there was research, you saw the research was criticized, but there are, I think, 8 countries that are in arrears or can fall into arrears. And for the region we're talking about, specifically Tajikistan and Mongolia. To conclude, the countries of Central Asia need economic growth. They are growing 3 to 4% a year on average. Some of them are more advanced than the others, like Kazakhstan. Some of them are corrupt or inefficient, like Tajikistan, for example. And state agencies and companies need to work with different patterns of financing, not just leave the field to the Chinese state-owned banks and companies to diversify sources of financing. Having said that, I think Singapore has a lot to offer to these countries, and it's really liked and admired. Lee Kuan Yew is a hero in a country like Kazakhstan. President Nazarbayev admires him and had friendship with him. I think that it's in the interest of all the countries around the Belt and Road to make it as multilateral as possible and not to have one locus, one location of decision making. And with that, I'll leave you with the questions. Is this just economic expansion? Is it collaboration and win-win? Or is it economic imperialism? Is it economic integration, or is it a political division between the East and the West? And do the rewards outweigh the risks? And with that, this is my co-author and our program, Energy Growth and Security Program at the International Tax and Investment Center, ITIC, that produced the report. The report is online. It's about 30 pages with more data. Please read it. If you have any questions, I'll be here today and tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen, for a very comprehensive and insightful presentation on infrastructure development in Central Asia. And more importantly, he kept within the 20 minutes I asked him to do so. Now, we go to our next speaker, Dr. Nasser Saidi. He is president of Nasser Saidi and Associates.
Thank you. And let me start first by thanking the Middle East Institute and Professor Ho for inviting me to be with you. I was asked to answer the question, is the Middle East ready for China? I'm going to give an answer towards the end, but as you'll see, as I slowly work up, I think you'll figure out what the answer is if you don't know it already. But here's the agenda. I'm going to first start about what is it we're talking about in terms of Middle East, North Africa. It's a very diverse region, so we need to understand it. So if you want to think about the Belt and Road Initiative, about any initiative concerning the Middle East, you also need to understand the landscape of the Middle East. We'll then talk about how the Middle East links with China have been growing and where they seem to be heading. But one of the messages that's going to come out very clearly is that although China has a very clear strategy towards the Arab world does not have an equivalent strategy vis-a-vis China. And so what I'm going to end with is talk about the building blocks of what would be a strategic partnership between China and the Middle East. And I'm going to mention some very specific initiatives that can help move forward this relationship. So let's start off with this map of the Middle East. What I want you to look at, of course, is the big discrepancies in per capita income. So what you have in here is the population in terms of millions. The total population is well in excess of 360 million. But look at the discrepancies in per capita income, real per capita income, from a Sudan around less than $800 to a Qatar at $68,000. So vast discrepancies in per capita income, wealth, and distribution of income across the countries of the region. And as we know, when you have discrepancies like that across countries or even within countries, it is always a source of tension, both political tension and social tension. And you'll see I've also had little flames to indicate countries which are either in transition, in tension, or in turmoil. In transition, that means countries that are trying to transform themselves, move away from previous models. And the little triangle, the green triangle, are where you've had regime change. But the overall message I want you to look at is right at the top. A country, a region which has close to 48% of the world's energy reserves in terms of oil, in terms of gas, big discrepancies, but with an unemployment rate of youth of 27%. 27% youth unemployment with young populations, fast-growing populations. So unless you address those issues of job creation and economic diversification, the region will continue to be in turmoil. So let's look at some of the quick links that we know in terms of China and the Middle East. The first one is that Asia, now there's been a tectonic shift, which we all talk about, this move in the world's global economic geography towards Asia and towards China. Asia now represents 45% of the Middle East trade. However, US and Europe are at 7 and 14%. So there's been a shift not only in economic geography, but also in the trade of the Middle East towards Asia. And the links, of course, are growing between the Middle East and China. Imports from China nearly doubled in 10 years. But much of it is, of course, in energy. All of the imports that China gets from the region are mainly focused on energy. And in return for that, you get consumption goods going in the other direction. What's more interesting, I think, is that beginning in 2016, China has now eclipsed the United Arab Emirates as the main investor in other MENA region countries. This is unprecedented. Previously, it was Saudi Arabia and the UAE who were the main investors in other countries in the Middle East. It is now China that is the major investor in other countries in the Middle East. So the trade and investment links are growing across them. The main message, however, is that, again, China is focusing on energy and energy projects. So when it invests in the countries of the Middle East, it is mainly looking at energy. Whereas there are, at the moment, more than $3.5 trillion worth of infrastructure projects and development projects across the Middle East. But yet, China has not really gone into those at the moment. The other two areas that I'll come back to in a minute concerns banking and finance, and there's rapid growth in terms of the links on banking and finance, and of course, tourism. If I take just the UAE last year, some 770,000, close to 1 million tourists went into the UAE just last year. And the size of the tourism flow into the region is the fastest growing, rapidly growing. So this is the background in terms of economic and trade and investment links. Now, when I mentioned that China has a clear policy, they call the Arab policy is 1, 2, 3. By 1, 2, 3, China says that number one is energy cooperation. The two wings are infrastructure and construction. Trade and investment are the two wings of the strategy. And the tail of the strategy, once you develop the first two, is to go into new technology, including nuclear energy, space, and new energy, renewable energy. And China has outlined this in terms of a policy paper. And when the Arab countries have looked at that, it is very much accepted by the Arab countries because the overall objectives are to safeguard state sovereignty, territorial integrity, seek political resolution to hotspot issues, and of course, combat extremism. And this is shared both by China as well as all the Arab countries. So there is a little bit of consensus in terms of what China wants from the Arab world. The reverse, however, is a different story, and this is what we're going to get to. So if you look at China, the China policy building blocks are very clear. They're political cooperation, investment and trade, social development, cultural, peace and security. So they cover really all aspects of the relationship between China and the Arab countries. This is all well laid out. Now, let's look at what would be the equivalent from an Arab point of view. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put myself in the shoes of an Arab policymaker. I will preface that by saying there is no such thing as an Arab policymaker. There are many policymakers with different perspectives and objectives. But I'm going to look at it from an analytical point of view and say to myself, if I were to construct what would be a strategy for the Arab world or any individual Arab country, and particularly the GCC, vis-a-vis China, what would be the building blocks? And those are the building blocks. So I'll talk about the BRI. I'll talk about some of the instruments that are now in place, the New Development Bank, the AIIB, and of course the ABRD. And I'm sure you've never heard what the ABRD is, and you're going to find out what I mean by ABRD in a minute. I'll talk about new initiatives and strategic initiatives in banking and trade, as well as clean energy and technology. So let's start off with what is familiar to all of us, namely the BRI. Now, you know the BRI, everybody talks about this, so I won't put up any maps, it's fine. But what is essential about the current BRI is that it bypasses the Middle East. By and large, apart from the maritime Silk Road, it just bypasses the Middle East. It creates a link between China, Central Asia, and Europe, but it goes past the Middle East. So what is it that the Middle East could do, and in particular, the GCC countries? The two strategic initiatives which I think are very important are these. The first is that we need to notice that for the past 30, 40 years, the GCC countries in particular have been building their infrastructure, and they have world-class infrastructure. And they've developed countries which can deliver that infrastructure. So the first strategic opportunity between China and the Arab countries, in particular the GCC countries, is to go into partnership in terms of building infrastructure, transport, and logistics. So a company like Amar from the UAE could certainly partner with many Chinese companies. And of course, the important thing here, they are state-owned or government-related enterprises. So they can speak the same language and they're supported by their countries. So this is an important area for cooperation between them. And the reason why it's so important for the countries of the Middle East is that it would allow them to integrate into the global value chains coming out of China. I mentioned the strategic priority for the Arab countries is job creation and economic diversification because they're too highly dependent on oil. Integrating into China's global value chains would allow them to diversify their economies. And the final thing is that the Middle East countries have plentiful capital. Much of that is invested outside. It's invested in Europe and the United States. With the BRI, you have the possibility for the Middle East banks, including for Islamic finance, to finance a lot of the BRI projects. So that is an important strategic objective. The other, of course, is to build institutional links. If you don't have the institutional links, you end up with just a set of projects. And what you really need are the institutional links to support that. We have two institutions now in place, the AIIB and the New Development Bank. Now, a number of the countries of the region are already founding members of the AIIB, including Saudi, Qatar, the UAE, and Kuwait and Oman, so most of the GCC countries. The AIIB, as we heard a little bit in the morning session, has already approved projects in Oman, in particular Duqm, and having Muscat fiber ready by end 2021. But I think one can go further. What does it mean to go further? Is that the Gulf sovereign wealth funds and the various development funds, the Abu Dhabi Fund, the Saudi Development Fund, all of those could easily partner along with the Islamic Development Bank to co-finance AIIB and NDB projects along the BIR, Belt and Road Initiative. Why? This would be a big diversification and a hedge for their investments. It would help them diversify and open new countries for trade and investment for the countries of the Middle East. The other and probably more important one over the long term, and you'll see that I'm talking strategy here, I'm talking about longer term. First point is to realize that many countries in the Middle East have been destroyed by wars and violence and extremism. They include Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, I don't know why twice, Libya, Sudan, and Yemen. These countries have been destroyed, and if you look at the cost of reconstruction, you're talking about close to $1.4 trillion worth for the reconstruction and redevelopment of many of the countries of the region. And I think the important message here, and it's a political message, if we don't rebuild the countries that have been destroyed by war, we are opening them up for a renewal of extremism and violence. Daesh, ISIS, and all the rest will come back unless we rebuild countries like Syria and Iraq. And the longer we take to do so, the greater the risks that extremism will come back. So one specific strategic opportunity I think exists that would be a partnership between the GCC, other Arab countries, and China, along with others, the World Bank, and others, would be to set up an Arab Bank for Reconstruction and Development, whose objective would be to be involved in reconstruction and development of countries that were destroyed by war. So another specific opportunity. On the banking and investment side, again, you already have linkages. Chinese banks are now present in the Middle East, and in particular, they're present in the GCC, in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Qatar, and others. But I think you need to go further. If you really want to think of how do you finance the BRI, you need to think about linking the financial markets. That means linking Shanghai with Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Riyadh capital markets. That would mean that securities issued by companies which are doing projects along the BRI would be listed in those stock exchanges, and you could finance them in both regions. The other important thing is to develop the renminbi zone and extend the renminbi zone to include the countries in particular of the GCC. If you're trading mostly with China, and we've seen already that the main partner today of the Middle East countries is China, then the next step really is to start using the renminbi in trade. There's no reason why you should be using the US dollar or the euro to finance GCC or Arab country trade with China. And in particular, I think the very promising thing for the future is what's being called the petro-yuan. China can validly turn around to many of the Arab exporting countries and say, I buy your oil, you buy my goods. Why should we use another currency to finance that trade? Let's use renminbi. Obviously, that's not going to happen tomorrow. It'll require deep capital markets. It'll require the opening up of the Chinese capital markets. You need depth in terms of the financial markets to do so. But that's another strategic opportunity. The minister early on at lunch mentioned, and also at morning, mentioned free trade agreements. They are important because they provide you with a framework for trade and investment. China and the GCC countries have started negotiating back in July 2004. They still are negotiating to today. And you'll tell me, well, in the meantime, the GCC no longer exists. Of course, de jure, it's still there. De facto, it's missing one member. So one of the things that you have to do is that you need to accelerate the free trade agreement and try to think perhaps of bilateral, if not a multilateral free trade agreement, a bilateral free trade agreement between China and individual countries. And the reason why that is so important is because you're opening up not only trade in goods, you're opening it up for services. And services is the fastest growing component of international trade today. So a free trade agreement with China needs to be a comprehensive one, including investor protection and other elements. So what are the strategic opportunities? Number one, finalize the GCC and other financial free trade agreements. There's been one with Singapore, but that is not given all the potential. And part of the reason why it didn't give it all the potential is that it does not include a lot of China trade. Other element, again, on the currency side, is for the GCC countries and other Arab countries to participate in the China International Payment System. That would mean that you would facilitate the use of renminbi for tourism as well as trade and investment. But I think one needs to go further. And the next one, I think, is digitalization. If you look across the Arab world, it's the highest population on earth of percentage of population who are without access to financial services, So already Alipay, Baidu, WeChat are already present in the region. So e-commerce is starting to penetrate through the Chinese companies. But you should really go a bit further. And this is an opportunity for a deep partnership between the Arab countries and the GCC in particular, and China on digitalization. So instead of talking about the Silk Road, we should talk about the digital Silk Road. We should talk about the digital economy, about digital trade. That is where the future lies. And in particular, I think fintech for both financial access as well as inclusion is the critical bit, because that would mean you start addressing poverty in the Arab world. And I just want to remind you of the first slide I showed you, which showed these big discrepancies across the countries. So you have fast-growing countries, high youth unemployment, but without access to finance, without financial inclusion. Fintech can be the key to including them in the new economy. Next one, I think, and this is a big one, concerns renewable energy. Already on a global basis, China is the leader in terms of renewable energy. It's certainly the largest investor. It produces more renewable energy than all of Europe put together, and it has more solar capacity than any other country in the world. And if you look at the electric vehicle market, it is clear that China will dominate the electric vehicle market in the years to come. It's investing heavily into battery technology and is already at the forefront. Now, what does that mean for the oil-producing countries? The big danger, of course, for the oil-producing countries is that they will end up with a natural resource which becomes a stranded asset, which may no longer be worth extracting from the ground. So what do you need to do? You need to start partnering with China on renewable energy. Remember that the GCC countries, most of the oil producers, have plentiful solar power. So if you produce the solar power there, you invest in the technology, you could be an exporter of the technology, and you can also be an exporter of electricity produced from solar power in that region. Tourism I mentioned, so I won't go over that again. But what you really want to do is to integrate the tourism infrastructure between the Arab countries, and particularly the GCC and China, to benefit from this large flow of tourism. So let me end with the following. Is the Middle East ready for China? The Middle East is not yet ready for China. It's still very much work in progress. You need a clear policy. You need clear policy instruments. It's one thing to say, I have my strategy. It's another thing also to say you have policy. You need instruments to implement that policy. And you need to overcome barriers. And the barriers are there, and I mentioned them. I think the first barrier is that you don't have a single voice. You don't have a unified voice across the Arab countries. Different perspectives, and again, different objectives. China comes, however, with a big political advantage. It has no colonial or imperialist baggage. Whereas if you look at Europe and even the United States, the outlook from the Arab countries is different. They come with a lot of baggage, historical baggage. China does not come with that historical baggage. So that creates possibility of greater agreements between them. However, what you're missing is you don't have the institutional links. And that's why in my talk I mentioned the number of institutions that need to be set up and institutional links that should be put in place. You need people to know each other. We've had a very, very long history of connections with China. However, we've never developed institutional links, and you need to put those in place. And I think the major issue, of course, and part of the subject of this conference is rivalry between China and the United States. And it's playing out in the Middle East. As the Middle East tries to turn towards China, the US will resist that. So the big political question for the countries of the Middle East is how are they going to manage that rivalry, because they are in the middle of it. They are in the middle of it because they have the natural resources. So the bottom line for me is that there are many strategic opportunities to exploit between China and the Arab world and the GCC in particular. And I think of China basically as a development partner for us. One that's not just about trade and investment, but that allows you to help in reconstruction and redevelop a lot of countries that got destroyed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nasser Saidi, for a very insightful exposition on the potential building block of China-Middle East Joint Development Partnership. Our third speaker is Mr. Yee Ean. He is presently Director General of Investment Operation Department of Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. He was actually my former colleague. Now he flies the Singapore flag in AIIB. He will talk about infrastructure investment in Middle East and Central Asia.
Thank you, Chairman. And thanks to Middle East Institute for having me here to share my passionate thoughts about Central Asia and Middle East, an area where I spent about 1.5 years of my life pursuing infrastructure projects. The earlier presentations by Dr. Saidi and Dr. Cohen, a wonderful introduction to these two regions. And I must say that a particular remark made by Dr. Cohen made me change my strategy for my presentation today. I'm not sure, it's for the good thing. Thanks for the point. Thank you, sir. He made a point, I'm not sure you caught it. I hope the camera didn't catch my face, with my expression in reaction. He made the point that the general feeling in the market is that AIIB is still a Chinese bank. Wow, it hurts. But that is the correct perception, sir. There's to some extent that's true, the general market perception. But there are also people who just don't want to give up that idea that AIIB is no longer a Chinese policy bank. So I'm changing my presentation. No, just joking. But I'll emphasize certain points that I would prove to you that in a subtle way that we don't drive the policies of China. And by the way, I hope he didn't catch the expression where I was shocked. Thank you. Oops, that's not my presentation. Is it? Oh, the other way. No. Okay. What am I going to do now? Okay. So, is it my pushing? I tried both ways. Okay, maybe I'll just fill the time for the emphasis of my presentation would largely be from the investment perspective, using the wonderful statistics that you had from the previous presentation. You probably have an idea how this market looks like, the Middle East and Central Asia. To me, this we have to all look at the Central Asia and Middle East as you have to decide whether it's a glass half filled or half empty. A lot of potential if you see the room for growth, and a lot of problems if you see that it has not grown enough. Okay, here it is. All right. Thank goodness. Okay. So this is to the left is my current office in Beijing, our current office, and then by end of year, if you're not visiting us and you're going to visit us by the end of the year, we're probably in the new place nearer to the Olympic Park. So I'm showing you this so that you can find your way to look for me with projects that we can help finance. All right. So AIIB, let's look at the ancient Silk Road. So when you look back into ancient Silk Road, did it belong to the Chinese, or it belonged to the little worm that produced silk? The Chinese might have inspired the trade, but does the Silk Road belong to the Chinese? It belongs to the whole Trans-Europe Asia belt that pans across both on the land as well as on the sea. Why? There is a value proposition for everybody. All right. So therefore, there's amalgamation of trade. There's an integration of systems. There's exchange of people during those days. All right. And well, if you look at AIIB, yes, in 2013, the idea of setting up AIIB was initiated. It is to fill an infrastructure gap in Asia. So with that in mind, we have since moved on. And it's my duty to report to you how we have moved on in the last 3 years. Most of the multilateral development banks only did their first projects in 3 years, but we have since gone further ahead. We are a multilateral development bank, is what they call the Bretton Woods system, right? Where where countries come together, chip in their money, all right, and then we together we dispense to the countries that needed help, and therefore the world gets to be a better place. All right. So we had a target to address the 26 trillion infrastructure funding gap that was identified during those days. 26 trillion. You know, there are so many zeros behind that. Our mission to improve the economic and social development in Asia and beyond through a focus on sustainable infrastructure, cross-border connectivity, and private capital mobilization. I'll explain a little bit on it. We have been rated 3 AAA, international AAA ratings by S&P, Moody's, and Fitch. All right, and our core values are lean, clean, and green. So that's a mantra, you know, every breakfast, lunch, and dinner we chant lean, clean, green, lean, clean, green. Right? So lean, why lean? Because we believe that we keep a lean entity. Without the country office, we can run faster. The projects come to us quickly, and we mobilize our resources to support it very quickly. So we turn around projects in 3 months, and we have, I believe generally over the last 3 years, we have impressed a lot of our partners and clients on those. All right. Clean, we believe infrastructure has been long tainted by corruption because of the sheer size of projects and elements of fraud. All right. So we are going to propound the standard of infrastructure development without the fraudulent aspect. And green, as an organization that started after the Paris climate change, we're very committed to green. So if we were a China policy bank, will we be given the 3 AAAs by the American institutions? I'm not sure. All right. And then the other fact is, look, we started with 57 founding members, and now we have 93. And this 93 pans across Asia to Europe, Africa, and the Americas now. So this 93 members is a testimony that we have run the organization without the influence of the Chinese government. And that I trust that you can see that the countries will they can see that the Chinese is not imposing its will on the organization. All right, and with that, and that's where our membership continues to grow, and that's the exciting part that we are going through. So the top 5 shareholders, China, of course, with the biggest share, all right, but that is only limited to 26%. Actually, their rights that is given to the Chinese is not equivalent to some of the other founding organizations or other multilateral development banks. In India coming next, and Russia, Germany, and Korea. So among the top 5, 4 are our regional members in Asia. So we have a very different way of running this organization. We don't have a resident board. We have empowerment for us to approve projects even without going to the board. So there are subtle changes in our organization that makes us run more effective. And this organization goes like that. It has a board of governors, which are mainly the ministers level that's guiding us, and then the board of directors, the president, and the vice president. Okay, so if the top senior management of the bank, the 21 of us, there are only 3 Chinese amongst us. And by the way, the majority, the decisions are made by a supermajority. On the supermajority basis, China is subjected to the same, is limited to its own voting rights. And so far, we have very much operated on consensus basis and not on voting basis. That shows that there are major alignment in the thoughts of the countries in terms of operating AIIB. So I mentioned about what is our focus. Our focus is to do three things, all right? The sustainable infrastructure that will contribute to a lower carbon footprint. The cross-border connectivity. Connectivity is correlated to the GDP, and therefore a cross-border connectivity will tie countries together. That's our objective. And private sector mobilization, private capital mobilization, we hope for more private sector capital to be involved in infrastructure. Let's look at the kind of projects that we are doing. We have 35 projects, about 45 contracts thereabouts, and majority, no surprise, 34% goes to energy and 26% to the transport sectors. And who has been the major borrower from us? It wouldn't be India if the Chinese, if you know about the hot and cold relationship between China and India, then this is a testimony that India, being the largest borrower from AIIB, will prove that it's not driven by the agenda of the Chinese. All right, so we have India as number one, Indonesia. Turkey is also one of our favorite markets. All right, in fact, we invested in Turkey during the volatile currency period. It took us a lot of consideration, and we have gone ahead with close to $1 billion worth of investment. And tomorrow when I get back, there'll be we are approving more projects for Turkey. All right, and then we have other countries that come along. If you notice, we have 93 members, I told you, right? But this is a list of quite few countries to start off with. And therefore, it proves our point that we are at our starting toddler stages. We're trying to reach out to more countries. And the reason why we attend seminars like this is to reach out to you as our partners. I mentioned that we will keep ourselves lean. Because we keep ourselves lean, we need partners like yourself to help us suss out the project, implement the project. All right, and that's why we always say that when AIIB is successful in 5-10 years' time, it should be the success of our partners as well. Our priorities: energy, transport, sustainable cities, and thematic priorities. I think I've covered them. So allow me to, okay, so sorry, one more slide. The products and the type of financing that we do in AIIB. First, we do the public sector financing, covering the sovereign-backed financing that has a sovereign guarantee, and on the private sector, those projects without the sovereign guarantee. And the way we have approached it is quite different from our big brothers like World Bank and ADB. We're very open to state-owned enterprises. We're open to municipal governments, and so on and so forth. Now to the main topic of Middle East and Central Asia. I would go through what are our projects that in this region, not all of them, all right, but give you a flavor of what our take of the situation. First, take a macro perspective. So the infrastructure spending per capita of Central Asia and Middle East is very much lacking the North America and Europe. If I'm gonna plot China on this chart, China is closer to 20,000 US dollars per capita, despite the big population base. So they are about this region. So you can see, despite a smaller population base, the spending in Central Asia and Middle East is very much lower. I highlighted Turkey. Per year or absolute? Per year. Per year. Yeah, on a year basis, yeah. All right, and then from a private sector perspective, we are keen on how the ease of doing business. As you know, infrastructure business has high risk because of long gestation, subject to the political interpretations and so on and so forth, and then currency markets and so on and so forth. So the ease of doing business is something that we look at it with keen interest. If you notice, the likes of Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and so on and so forth is generally on the upward trend in terms of ranking. That means somebody else is dropping, but they are moving up. All right. So countries like this, as mentioned by Dr. Cohen and Dr. Saidi, they are fairly in their initial stages of development. They are opening up. All right. As they open up, the transparencies are coming up, and I'll elaborate later. This is Middle East and Turkey. Over the last 2 years, there's also a general upward trend. I'm not sure about Oman because it's one of my favorite markets. Certainly, they should be performing better, and I'll explain why as well. Some of the featured projects. Dokkum Port. I think early this morning there was a comparison made on Dokkum Port. Dokkum Port is in Oman. This is a project that essentially is part of the grand strategy of Oman to diversify beyond their dependence on the crude oil. So they are developing this port supported with their industrial park and with a mineral-based strategy to transport through rail and then able to do refinery within the port itself. So this Dokkum Port development is a major project that the Omani government is embarking on. On our part, we are financing the port as a first tranche. We are looking at their railway systems to support their minerals transport, as I mentioned. We are looking at their LNG facilities, storage facilities, and so on and so forth. By the way, it is run by the CEO of Dokkum Port is a Singaporean, I think this is one of the major developments in Oman that is worth folks like ourselves to look at. And Mr. Teng, who is our ambassador for Oman, would be able to provide you with more reasons to invest in Oman. All right, so Oman is one of our more successful markets, and this second project is a broadband, also mentioned in the earlier slides. This is a broadband project that we enabling the fiber optic network throughout Oman, a single system without different telcos duplicating each other, something like our OneNet in Singapore. All right, so this investment, not just ourselves, we brought in other banks to co-finance alongside us. And we have Indian banks, we have Chinese banks, we have Chinese funds, and we have other parties that is supporting us for this Oman project. Another country that captures the imagination of an ideal country to invest is actually Egypt. If you ask the IFC's EBRD, and of course ourselves, we're very excited about the recent development of Egypt after what it has gone through in these recent years. If you look at the macro statistics, it may not tell you everything because you will see still high debt servicing ratios and so on and so forth. But if you are engaging on the ground, you will notice we have a very vibrant private sector that propels the economy, and you can see that the government is very determined to restructure its policy, including having higher tariffs for energy and so on and so forth. They are also very committed to transport systems, and they are developing new development areas. So for Egypt, other than this solar project that we are involved in, we are also looking at its metro systems, we are looking at its sanitation systems, and so on and so forth. So there could be a lot of opportunities you may want to take a look at. I'm quoting a few other countries, some of the projects that we do. And one of the most significant ones is in Azerbaijan. And earlier on, we mentioned there are a lot of energy resources in the region. This is an example of one of them. This is a TANAP project, Trans-Anatolian Natural Gas Pipeline Project. It runs from the Caspian Sea to the Dead Sea, and it's supposed to go beyond up to supplying the gas, natural gas, to the rest of the Europe. And if you follow the gas industry closely, actually it is a situation of most you have very big consuming countries like China and Europe all increasing their dependency on gas as they allow their coal-fired plants to retire. All right. Georgia is a country that we are very active in. This is Batumi Bypass Road, which has it's a very tedious project, and in fact every day I kind of ask my teammates what is going on that project, because it's a very technically challenging project, because it has bridges and tunnels and so on and so forth that we have to take care of. Other than this project, we are looking at the generation projects that is in Georgia. A lot of hydro potential that we are looking at, and again the road projects. Earlier on, it was mentioned the east-west and north-south highways and railways are being developed. Tajikistan, we have limited exposure. We have road project there. We have one road project there, and we have a hydro rehabilitation project ongoing. Uzbekistan, personally, I feel there is another Egypt in the making. Uzbekistan is a double landlocked country. Perhaps I move on to the next slide. It's a double landlocked country. That means to say it has to pass one more country, then it reaches to a country that has sea access. Right? So it is a double landlocked country. In the past, they have always closed up as a communist country, looking at being more enclosed and self-functioning. All right, but they realize that they have to open up, and with this open up, they are exploring new connections around them. And this can be railways, and this can be gas pipelines. They are proactively looking at different ways to get access to energy, and that is a country that a lot of NDBs are also looking at. If you allow me to add on to the earlier statistics on Central Asia, please look at Uzbekistan with 32 million population compared with Kazakhstan, 18, and the rest are much smaller. The energy consumption per capita is lower than most of them, and we are talking about countries in Central Asia. All right, if you compare against advanced country, the energy consumption will definitely has a lot of room to grow. With that, I've given a favor. All right, I know that time's up, and thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian, for a very excellent exposition on infrastructure investment in the Middle East and Central Asia, particularly the role of AIIB. Maybe I'll take advantage of my chairmanship to ask the first question. Singapore has at least three major strengths. The first core strength of Singapore is we are a multiracial, multi-religious country. This is fragile, and we protect it very well, and this is an important core strength. The second strength is that we have long experience as an open, inclusive financial sector. The Americans, the Europeans, the Japanese, the Indians, the Indonesians, all their private sector banks and companies are comfortable operating here. We have a strong legal institutions and pro-business environment. Our third strength is that we are small and non-threatening. We are like a squirrel, we don't have sharp claws like the soaring eagle or the fire-spewing dragon, or let alone the growling polar bear. So for financing infrastructure, we have this transparent commercial orientation focusing on bankable projects. For countries that are afraid of death threat, over dependence on China, we are a very attractive proposition as a base. So my question is directed at the panel. So instead of the issue is how Singapore can play an effective role so that the BRI, instead of degenerating into China's strangling belt or Xi Jinping's road to nowhere, it will become a development program that help Middle East, South Asia, Central Asia, Africa to develop their economies. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
You mean on the specific role of Singapore?
Yeah, Singapore and BRI and Middle East. And
I think what strikes me the most in terms of the input of Singapore is that, number one, you're very well located. So location is a big advantage in terms of looking at where the BRI might be heading. I think that's one element. Second, I think you have a very well developed financial sector. It should be fully engaged with the BRI. When I mentioned Middle East banks, and there was an example of Oman and Duqm Port, which was co-financed not only by IIIB, but by local banks as well. This is an example for the future, it seems to me. And Singapore has extensive experience with financing infrastructure, including PPP type opportunities. So I think you should be using Singapore's financial technology expertise in partnering with AIB and looking at financial constructs where you bring in banks from the Middle East. Again, banks from the Middle East are extremely liquid, but they use that liquidity outside the Middle East. This is a role that Singapore can play, and including on an element I think Professor Ho was mentioning earlier this morning, mobilizing Islamic finance. Again, infrastructure is very suited for Islamic finance because you can own an asset, you can lease that asset, you part with it once it's been financed. So Islamic finance can be used for many of the BRI projects. Somebody needs to put that together, and I think Singapore can play that role. The third role, offhand, is an analytical role. You not only have financial sector expertise, but you also have people who are capable of analyzing projects. Many of the countries that we're talking about don't have that capacity. So at the official government level, in terms of development institutions that they have, they don't always have the analytical capacity to judge the economic, financial feasibility of a project, let alone the technical feasibility of a project. So that to me could be a role that Singapore can play along with the AIIB. And maybe one thing that the Middle East Institute could do is to have a program where you invite people from the BRI countries to come in on technical assistance, teaching them how to analyze a project from many points of view. Because you have that advantage, you have a highly educated population, and you could help them do that. So I would just say, open up the Middle East Institute along with with NUS and other capabilities that you have to help train people, build capacity so that they know what they should be building, and then you wouldn't get stuck with debt problems, right? Because they may make sure that they have the capacity to service the debt, that the market is there, that they would get the revenue to pay back.
Thank you.
Thinking about the challenges of the Central Asian countries, and I will defer to Mr. Saidi on the Middle East. The challenges, to my mind, and I'm tracking them for 27 years, whatever, since the independence, is insufficient human capital, weak rule of law, administrative red tape, corruption, the lack of working institutions, especially on the legal side, but also in parliament, and problems with the executive power. In many cases, lack of openness and lack of capital. This means, in many cases, some of these countries, in certain way, are the exact opposite of Singapore. And Singapore, in my view, can export its model, as they say, mutatis mutandis, with applicable changes. Clearly, those countries do not have such a hardworking population in many cases. They do not have the legacy of the British law. They are not in a warm climate on a major transportation artery from the east to the west. Having said that, there's a lot of interest in how can these countries open up to the outside world. I'll give you one example. President Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan is now enforcing trilingual education. They'll have their education in Kazakh, they'll have the Russian language because it's traditionally the language, because there's a big Russian-speaking population there, not just ethnic Russians, but others. And they'll have English from the first grade. Does that remind you of something? Yes, it does. They have English law in the Astana International Financial Center, but Kazakhstan is a leader. There are 4 other countries that are either just opening up, like Uzbekistan, or don't open up, like Turkmenistan. And Singapore is not threatening like Russia or China or the United States. Nobody can suspect that Singapore has any kind of great power aspirations, but you can sell, quote unquote, your model to these countries. For example, business education. Good MBA programs here or there would take these countries a long way into having people who are educated to do business. Public administration. Lee Kuan Yew School, somebody mentioned, in Kazakhstan, but also here. It's expensive. People will need to figure out who is going to finance. Are the countries going to take loans from the World Bank or from maybe AI? Does AIIB finance education? I don't know. You don't know. The World Bank does. I worked on World Bank projects doing legal education in countries that just emerged from the imperial rubble of the Soviet Union, and the results are not great, clearly. Openness, religious tolerance, inter-ethnic relations are all very, very important. Thank God, with the exception of Tajikistan, these countries did not go through any massive inter-ethnic or religious conflicts. There were little things in Kyrgyzstan, well, not little, every life is sacred, but there were some people who lost their lives in Kyrgyzstan, but other than that, the region is relatively stable, but Afghanistan is right next door. And by the way, when we have this discussion, let's include Afghanistan with all the challenges. Post-war reconstruction was mentioned by Mr. Saidi vis-a-vis the Middle East, but Afghanistan is a huge, huge challenge for rebuilding and building up the economy. I think I can stop here, and if anybody has further questions, we can chat after this. But building a strong relationship with each individual country will lead to business opportunities for Singaporean business.
I think the earlier 2 speakers have covered most of the points. I'll take a question from another perspective, is what Singapore should be looking at to enter those markets. I think first and foremost, I think the exposure to Middle East, uh, North Africa, and Central Asia, uh, Singaporeans' exposure to this region is quite limited. We are more familiar with the Southeast Asia, perhaps to South Asia, to North Asia, but perhaps going beyond that, we are very limited. The traditional Middle East, the wealthy part of Middle East, which is the GCC countries, have always been financed by London. If we want to take that market, then we need folks who are as good as the Londoners, who are willing to travel, willing to spend their time in that market to understand it better. For Central Asia, there is a lot of potential that I've mentioned, but I think it takes a lot of patient capital and patience effort. That will need us to take a long-term perspective to some of this. It's not for the faint-hearted. It's not for those of us who are seeking immediate results. Bridging the distance, we have to spend that effort, and it should come right from the youngs. From the young, we should start sending our younger executives out there to explore a market on their own. We have, in Singapore, we have resource limitation. Um, Partnering with certain types of partners that is complement to your business is useful. And in this respect, the Chinese and the Indian sponsors are good parties to work with. These are people who has the capital to move on to all this region. And please be selective on which markets that you want to go in. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I'd like to open the question to the floor. Okay, Prof. Ho.
Thank you, Prof. Khan, for opening up this question of the roles of the mic. Thank you, Prof. Khan, for opening up this question. Of the role Singapore can play by first characterizing what Singapore looks like. I'd like to ask perhaps Dr. Nasser Saidi and anybody else who wants to come in. If I look at it from two different directions, Singapore going to the Middle East, Singapore has made its name, developed its game on a very stable political context. Now, for Singapore to go into the Middle East, it's a bit scary. Nevertheless, individual Singaporeans have gone in ahead of the government. We see, for example, Dr. Michael Huang, and there are many others like him. So, one question for Dr. Saidi is going into the Middle East, one can think in terms of sequencing, point of entry. Where would be points of entry for Singapore to enter, which are within Singapore's comfort level, and can, in a way, guide Singapore through different stages or different steps into the Middle East? So that's one question. The other question from the other side is I take very much your point that Singapore can do some teaching or introduction for parties from the Middle East to learn to do development, project analysis, and so on. If you look around the world, you and I in the Middle East, you look around the world to look at our peer institutions. What I see are mostly institutions interested in political rivalries, Islamic terrorism. These are the institutions in Washington, London, Paris, and so on. I haven't really seen any which has the sort of focus you were talking about, business, economics, project analysis, and so on. Do you think there is a role for some organization like MEI in Singapore to do this sort of thing for Middle Eastern parties? Thank you.
If you ask me that question maybe 25 years ago, I would have given you a different answer. Today, the answer is very clear. Your entry point has got to be the GCC countries. Your entry point within the GCC countries has got to be the UAE. Why? If you look at the UAE, very open, low level of tariffs, open to investment, rule of law, particularly in the free zones, and openness to trade across the region. And I think two important things that we have to keep in mind. If you look across the whole Arab region, the two biggest economies, of course, are Saudi Arabia and the UAE, number two. Saudi Arabia simply because it's bigger, it's got plentiful natural resources. But UAE has become much more diversified. So it is by far the most diversified country within the GCC and within the Middle East. And therefore, it can benefit the most from a partnership with Singapore across a whole range of areas. And let me mention at least two. In terms of transport and logistics, whether we're talking about BRI or simply developing infrastructure, the transport and logistics infrastructure, by which I also include digital infrastructure, is a critical one. So if I take Singapore, it is a hub in Southeast Asia, in the same way as UAE is a hub for the GCC. But more important, if you look at the links of China and now with the GCC, something like 60 to 65% of the exports of China to the UAE are re-exported to other countries. Why? It's because of the quality of the infrastructure. A lot of it goes into India, into other countries. India has terrible infrastructure. So if you send a ship there, it might spend 2 weeks in demurrage. And who wants to pay demurrage fees and have your capital frozen on board a ship instead of being in the market? So everybody brings their ships there, and then it goes into smaller ships. So you need a country that is the entry point to other countries in the region. Duqm, for example, is an answer to a different question. It's a question of how do you get up the Red Sea and maybe enter into East Africa and South Africa. Dubai and the others are an answer how do you get into the hinterland. And they're developing a railroad system, in principle, the GCC railroad system. So Duqm eventually will be linked to a railroad system that will go all the way from the Arabian Peninsula into Iraq, and from there into Syria, potentially into Turkey. So the potential for infrastructure expanding is from the GCC countries to the others. And they are the major investors. So the GCC countries, in particular the UAE and Saudi, are the major investors in other countries, whether it's Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, or others. And for them, it is a strategic issue. They need to make sure that a country like Egypt does not fail. Egypt has become too big to fail in many ways. So they need to make sure that Egypt is stable, creates jobs. Just to give you an idea about the scale of the problem, every year 700,000 young people come into the labor market in Egypt. You need to create jobs for them. Otherwise, they're going to end up in Tahrir Square, like happened before. So everybody really has the incentive to make sure that those countries develop. And I think this is where Singapore can bring its expertise. And again, a lot of partnerships on the technology front, fintech, Monetary Authority of Singapore. I'll give you an example. We had a conference 2 weeks ago, which was on corporate governance of central banks in Dubai. We had a representative from MAS, from the Monetary Authority, who was working on the digital transformation of the Monetary Authority. And the potential there in terms of applying artificial intelligence, blockchain, and related technologies will transform banking. And so you are at the forefront. So this is another entry point, I think, into the GCC. And finally, I mean, I think the point is very simple. Um, the infrastructure requirements, as we saw a bit earlier, of the Middle East are enormous. The numbers that were shown disguise the fact that you have a big discrepancy between the oil producers and the non-oil producers. The GCC countries as oil producers have quality infrastructure. It is all the other countries, the Egypt, the Tunisia, the Morocco, the Iraq, the Syria, and everybody else whose infrastructure has been destroyed that needs to be rebuilt. I think this is where you can bring Singaporean expertise. And again, you would be very trusted because you are, as Ariel was mentioning a bit earlier, non-threatening. So you can speak the same language, and there's no threat that you bring to the table.
Okay, there are three more questions. So Anthony first.
Mr. Chairman, yeah, I want to get on to Dr. Said. You posted correctly. China, very strategic on this, to areas like Middle East. And the question is Middle East as ready for China? And your answer to Prof. Ho's question is exactly like that. You can only do it in well-established places like GCC, like UAE. So the gap, if I could just take back a step, the gap in infrastructure financing has always been there. In 1970, ADB came out and forecast something like this. Okay? And ADB is like what Dr. Tan Kong Yam talks about. An animal that has no eagle claws, that doesn't breathe fire, that has wide shareholding. And in that sense, with ADB, with AAIB, when you do infrastructure, the issue must deal with what Said says. The infrastructure is just not physical infrastructure. There are 10 other things that you need to have there. And part of it might be what Dr. Said said, oh, Singapore is quite useful to help if your project is in UAE. If in Egypt, you got to get the British help because they have been there. But it's only one of 10 issues. You got to deal with the other 10 issues. So you have to be in a holistic manner rather than in a retail manner of providing a loan. Or else we'll be running around in circles.
You're absolutely right. You have to take it holistically. But what I would say is that, again, the economic geography of the Middle East has changed over the past 20 years. It has shifted towards the GCC countries because of higher oil prices and because they've been able to build up their sovereign wealth funds. But in a way, they have a similar problem to China. What do you do with all that money? What do you do with all that money? China developed a new development bank, the AIIB, because it needs to export capital. That's one way to do that. The other way is through state-owned enterprises and foreign direct investment. The third way is to open up your capital markets and allow the rest of the world to list securities. They haven't done that yet. Eventually, they will do so. Now, the GCC countries have developed economic power. The economic power is there. They trade and they invest. They haven't developed yet the full soft power. So what I'm suggesting, which is why I mentioned an Arab bank or a Middle East bank for reconstruction and development, is that it's the only region in the world that doesn't have such a development bank. You have an Asian development bank, you have a Latin, you have an African. Even the Europeans set up the EBRD because they had to deal with a problem. So we need an institution like that. And if I think of who the partner would be, this is why I think China and the AIIB and others can be the partners for that. And Singapore could be the godmother to that, if I choose the word, right? In terms of floating the idea, pursuing the idea, and again, because it's non-threatening. And I think, as we were discussing a bit earlier, this issue of building capacity is, I think, a critical one. If you want to build infrastructure, you not only build it, you need to maintain it. And maintaining it means you have to have the capacity to maintain it. Otherwise, you'll have a lot of white camels, not white elephants, a lot of white camels across the Middle East. So you need to make sure that you have the capacity to maintain it, that the people can analyze, etc. So I think, as we were mentioning a bit earlier, developing capacity at the level of public officials, business, and the rest is a critical one. And again, I think using the economic power of the GCC countries means that you can ride along into countries like Egypt, where otherwise you might not venture. But because of their economic power, you can co-partner into joint ventures with them, which gives you protection.
May I reflect on the point that you made, Mr. Anthony, on what is the AIIB's role in infrastructure? As you can see, AIIB has always been, we are set up for infrastructure. We are just set up for creation of capital stock of infrastructure. We are very, very precise. We do not want to do anything and everything in the whole space of development. Why do we choose that? Because number one, World Bank, ADB, and other agencies have already such competency, which includes policy advisory, which includes sectors like education and healthcare.
But do you blend that?
Sorry? We will focus, no, allow me to specify that we are engrossed with the capital stock. That means we are engrossed with creation of hardware and hardware only. You may think that, oh, why do you do that? As mentioned earlier, just creating the hardware, we have to build the competency, the associated environment to create this hardware. And many a times, we are engrossed by focusing on the hardware, we move faster. We move faster than a lot of policy makes. And for example, World Bank, if they're going to build a school and the road to the school, they'll be looking at what is the policy of the school, what is the racial mix of the school, the gender mix of the school, what is the syllabus of the school. We rather just build the road and the school. That is our focus. That is our focus. We are engrossed with the creation of hardware. And pardon us that we cannot do everything because exactly we felt that it will make us move faster by doing so. Yeah, that's our strategy. Thank you.
I think that the need for the infrastructure investment in the Middle East is well taken, well explained. And while in decades past, the United States would have been a source of capital, I think the United States is in the process of disengagement from the Middle East. Not entirely and not quickly, but with the shale gale, the shale revolution, with going from 5 million barrels a day 10 years ago to 12 today, and eventually 14 and becoming exporter of oil by 2020 or beyond, we're not as interested in the Middle East as we used to be. The question is whether the strategic competition with China will create a dynamic that will be similar to the dynamic of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. I hope not. I hope both sides should know better and should be more rational. I don't think we're ideologically as far apart as the United States was with the Soviet Union as we are today with China. But the Arab capital, the Chinese capital, Singapore as both a source of capital and the intermediary would be a terrific source for those projects. The question is whether who is going to manage the political risk? Because once you had sort of a Western dominated system with the World Bank and the IMF and the United States and the military power there were instruments for mitigating the political risk. Probably in the end, it will be up to Beijing to step in and to be the provider of political risk mitigation of last resort. Whether they can do it, do they have the instruments, do they have the strategy, do they have the people? Yeah, I think if they don't have it today, they'll have it in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. But that's a dynamic I'm looking at, and I think we are in the middle of a major, major transformation of the international system, both strategically and economically, in Central Asia and Eurasia at large, and in the Middle East and beyond, in Africa, Latin America, etc.
So just, well, I know our time's up, but very quickly. Absolutely right. We are getting a new international financial architecture. But I would say from the perspective of the Middle East, the role of the World Bank, IFC, they gave us many promises. It was dismal performance. If you look at how much infrastructure got built through those institutions in the Middle East, minimal. Net result is this is an impoverished area of the world, subject to a lot of pressure, tension, potential violence. And that's why I think you need new partners to come in. And that's why I mentioned, I think, you need China to be an economic partner for development and not just infrastructure. It has to be a wider role. And there was a failure. And I think this new international financial architecture, which is developing now, is potentially a promise for the future. We hope so. And yes, you're absolutely right. Somebody would need to give coverage for political risk and other types of non-economic risks.
Well, our timekeeper behind has been waving his red sign ferociously. So I think I'll end here. So may you join me in showing our deep appreciation to the three attendees.